book on the origins of women's oppression in the book Marxism and Women's Liberation, which is available from the Counterfire website. For the duration of the meeting, the chat will be closed for discussion. If you wish to message either myself or Elaine or the tech side of things, please feel free to do so. We're just closing the chat because people tend to find it quite distracting when there's almost like a parallel meeting going on in the side, and it's very difficult to focus on what's actually being said in the meeting. So we hope that that will actually enable a much greater concentration on all the interesting things that Elaine has got to say. At the end of Elaine's talk, we're going to have an opportunity for everybody to contribute through a Q&A session. And if you wish to speak, you just need to raise your hand through the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. But we can go through that then as well. So now over to you, Elaine, and we can begin.
Okay, thanks, Tarina. And that's no pressure at all, is it, to live up to the brilliant talks earlier in the series? So I'll do my best. So women's oppression is it's the oldest oppression in human society, and I think that's partly the reason why it's people sometimes regard it as if it's just inherent. That, you know, it's something that humans will always do, and indeed that other mammals do. I mean, I've heard people arguing that because male baboons are nasty to female baboons, that this shows that women's oppression is kind of inherent to a very wide range of species. And so therefore and therefore that view is that it would always exist, and it doesn't really matter what we do about overthrowing capitalism or anything, there'll always be women's oppression. So obviously that's not the Marxist position. So obviously if people have read Engels, he takes a very different view of that, as seeing women's oppression as part of exploitation. So it's what you get with a class society. And Engels, in his book, The Origins of Family, Private Property and the State, has various examples of really quite complex and developed societies that don't have class and therefore don't have women's oppression. So the examples that he gives is things like, or he calls them the Iroquois, the more modern term is the Haudenosaunee, who were a Native American group of peoples who didn't have a class system, and who had actually very equal positions for women, and women had great authority in their society. So that was sort of an example that Engels used to point out that the class and women's oppression go hand in hand. And there's other examples as well, which Engels didn't necessarily know about, like Indus Valley civilizations, various cities in ancient Anatolia, like Catalhoyuk, which again aren't class societies, even though they are very complex, developed societies. It's not the case that you can be a small band of hunter-gatherers, but as soon as you become at all complex, then you inevitably get women's oppression. These are quite big places, and they have quite high standard of living for the time, but they don't have class. And as far as we can tell, they don't have women's oppression. So so that's kind of an interesting historical fact in a sense, but obviously we're not just interested in this for historical reasons. The point is, well, how is that relevant to our fights against women's oppression today? So I think to understand how it's relevant, we have to go further than just that basic fact that class and women's oppression go together. We have to understand the mechanisms of how women's oppression developed as part of class. Because you could say that, okay, oppression is just an epiphenomenon of exploitative societies. You could just say, well, class societies make people nasty, so therefore this is part of being nasty. And it's true that the alienated nature of our consciousness under capitalism makes people nastier than we will hopefully the future generations will hopefully be when we have overthrown capitalism. So there's something in that, but of course it's not just the case that oppression is just kind of something that exploitative societies just kind of generate by accident. So what we have to understand is it's not just that it goes with class, it's that the development of women's oppression is actually an essential part of maintaining class societies. It's part of exploitation. It's not just an epiphenomenon of exploitation. And the problem with making this case, convincing you that this is the case, is that we don't have a lot of, it's not like we have written evidence for the development of women's oppression. And we do have evidence, we have archaeological evidence and so on. We have some anthropological evidence, although there's a bit there's kind of it used to be a fashion for so looking at modern societies who can be who sometimes can be regarded as being as if they're equivalent to other places in the Stone Age, and that's a really dubious practice. So we kind of need to be careful with that. We can't look at, for example, modern hunter-gatherer societies and say, oh well, they're like a time machine to go back to the Stone Age. So we kind of have to be careful with that. So there is a problem that we don't have a lot of evidence, therefore, for how women's oppression came about. But we do have much better evidence for the development of other oppressions because they're much later. So we actually do have quite a lot of written evidence that can give us clues about how anti-Semitism developed, how racism and anti-Black racism developed. And what those show us really clearly is that these oppressions are not things that come out of the bottom of society. So you might think that racism originates from ordinary people being prejudiced against Black people when they first start encountering Black people in Europe in, say, 14th century or 15th century, I suppose. And that is really, really not the case. We can see very clearly from the historical record that racism in Europe is really fairly deliberately developed by the ruling class. And actually the earliest examples where we have evidence for people coming across African people, say in Britain, is actually that people want to defend those Africans. So one of the very earliest examples is a merchant, I think it's a Genoese merchant in Plymouth, I think, in the 15th century, who was keeping a young African woman as a slave. And the reason we know about it is that the people of Plymouth revolted against this and forcibly freed her, and actually forced the authorities to say, no, there's no slavery in Britain at this time. She has to be free, and she has to be able to get away from this guy. So it was very much, but then we can see then the development of racism because it actually helped the monarchy support slave trade and profit from slave trading and so on. So we can see with examples like that oppression is something that is top down. It's developed by the ruling class because it helps them. So I think we can take that historical evidence that we've got about the development of anti-Semitism, the development of racism, and apply that to a model of how women's oppression would have developed. So that's the first thing that's giving us an indication that we're not talking here about men in class societies just being nasty. The development of oppression is kind of more purposeful than that. It's not something that just kind of arises from class society. It's part of how class is imposed on these early societies. So but we do still have to have a model for how it comes about. And there's a range of theories about why you get women's oppression specifically. So we can see, I think it's quite clear, the role that oppression in general plays in society and the way that it divides us so that it makes it more difficult for us to band together to stand against our exploitation. And clearly that would have been part of it. But in a way, you could divide society on any lines and achieve that. You could have an oppression based on whether your earlobes are attached to your head or kind of, or waggly. And then if you manage to get that into society enough, then that would be a division that would stop people from banding together. So that probably wouldn't really stick, but you get my point. So why women's oppression specifically? So there's a range of theories that come back in a way to that there's something inherent about women that mean that women's oppression kind of is possible to make happen in the establishment of class societies. So some of these are around women and caring responsibilities. So there's a whole bunch of theories that, well, women are just sort of stuck at home because they're the ones who have the babies and therefore they're the ones who care for the children and therefore they don't go out doing a range of high status activities. Therefore, once you start developing oppression in a society, therefore that's the way it's going to work because the women are already the ones who are kind of stuck in the household. Associated to that is this kind of idea, which I always call man, the mighty hunter, because this is a whole range of theories about sort of human prehistory that has that men are the ones who are going out and, bringing down the aurochs and various other prehistoric beasts, and therefore this is the high status activity. So therefore, once you're going to have an oppressive division in society, it's going to be the men who are going to be on top because they're the ones who are supplying the high status food. So these are quite pervasive theories. You'll be relieved to hear, I'm sure, that I think these are all bollocks. And there's a reasonable amount of evidence for why these are empirically bollocks. I mean, the Man, the Mighty Hunter stuff is just kind of, it just misunderstands actually what the human prehistoric diets are like. I mean, the major source of protein, as far as we can tell from archaeology of bone dumps and things, is rabbits. So you don't need to be a kind of a huge masculine hunter to kill a rabbit, really. This isn't very high risk activity. So the idea that that men get the high status food because hunting is dangerous and that women get the kind of the low status disregarded food, it's just really not tenable. So that's not a possible reason for why it's women who end up getting oppressed, not men. And the caring responsibilities things again, I mean, I think the problem here is that, you know, because we have so little evidence in many ways, models of what sort of prehistoric human society looked like almost always tell you more about the society that the paleontologists and the anthropologists and so on are from than actually the society that they're talking about. And there is this kind of pervasive model that makes kind of people in caves that sounds like the 1950s, you know. So this idea that actually that it would have been, because the women have the babies, that it would always have been women who were staying at home looking after the children. I mean, for one thing, this isn't capitalist production, so it's not the case that people go out to work in the sense that we do. But on the other, that actually when we have the evidence of these advanced non-class societies, like for example in Cattle Hayek, we have a fair number of wall paintings and things that show men apparently looking after children, fulfilling those caring responsibilities. So the evidence that we have is that actually that sort of really profound division of labor that we have in class societies and under capitalism isn't necessarily the case if you don't have women's oppression. So you can't argue from that because women have caring responsibilities, therefore that's why women's oppression. So we can throw out that whole kind of range of arguments that are kind of really bringing it back to an idea of what women are innately like, and therefore we're oppressed. And I think that's really important, because if we see it much more clearly as being genuinely about how class societies are created and maintained, we get away from any idea that there is somehow a natural division that means that women are oppressed and men are oppressive. And it's also, I think, and this is something where I think Engels and Morgan, who is the sort of the authority that he was using, their understanding of precisely how class comes about is somewhat outdated now. So Engels talks a lot, using Morgan, talks a lot about who controls the herds and who has the high status of things, and sort of men as herders and things. And I've talked about why that's wrong. But also that isn't now how we think that class develops. The more modern theory is that class is a result of agriculture. It's only when you start having sedentary agricultural populations that you start developing enough of a surplus, and indeed being able to store enough of a surplus. Because if you're nomadic populations, you don't want to have lots of stuff that you then just have to pack up and cart around. It's a pain. You have to be sedentary to actually want to build up kind of material things. But in any case, I mean, agriculture it gives you actually much more surplus than you do from a sort of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So it enables the amassing of property, which is obviously kind of a prerequisite to developing class. So what we think would have happened is that, okay, you have these agriculture populations, and at this point they're still equal. So, but what you probably would have is a development of a kind of a chief figure, and the chief is there not to have the bulk of the surplus, but to see that it's distributed fairly. So it's a way of making sure that your egalitarian society carries on being egalitarian. But eventually, the chief and their mates start getting a little bit more of their share than otherwise, and so on. And so over time, this becomes a hierarchy. And then once you've got a hierarchy, over time, that becomes, right, I am the king now, and what I say goes, and I'm going to build walls around the nicest bit of the village and say this is mine now. And then the structure that was developed to keep things equal becomes the structure of actually how you exploit the sort of lower classes in what's developed as a class society. The important thing here is that there's nothing in this model that says that the chief figure has to be a man. I mean, we kind of, immediately, as soon as I say the chief figure, I've got a picture in my head of a bloke, but it really doesn't have to be, and we shouldn't assume that they would have been. And after all, if we're thinking of this developing in agricultural production, women are going to be just as involved in agricultural production as the men are. There's no agricultural society where the women would sit at home while the men do the harvesting. I mean, all the community does the harvesting. And we actually, interestingly, there is some evidence which is kind of quite discredited, and it's a bit embarrassing to talk about it. And if you talk to historians of ancient Greece about matriarchy, they would go, oh no, we don't talk about that. But to be honest, I think it's still quite convincing that there have been possibly fairly short-lived, but it is possible to have actually matriarchal class societies where you have the developmental class, but the figures who are at the top of that hierarchy can be women. So the question is then, why do the version of class societies that have women's oppression win out over other possible structures of society that nevertheless have class? And what I think we need to understand here is how unstable these things are. Because we're looking at it from the picture, from the point of view of thousands of years of class society, it kind of feels really inevitable. You kind of think that, okay, the first moment when the chief figure is doing the distribution and he thinks, you know what? Or she thinks, you know what, I'm going to put a little bit more on my pile of my share of the harvest. We think, right, that's inevitable. Class has won. Here we are, capitalism, that's it. And the thing is that, that's in a sense with the benefit of hindsight. But these early class societies are incredibly unstable. You have both continuing class struggle within those societies. So the people who've heard me speak before, you'll have heard before about the Keonu Revolution, which is about 7,300 BC, I think, where you have a class society that is obviously overthrown and replaced by an egalitarian society. This is in an Anatolian city. And also they actually have these sort of early city-states have tremendous problems with just losing population, that people go, like, stop this for a game of soldiers, and they just go off and live outside the city-state where they can live outside of the sort of the early class society. So they are incredibly unstable formations. So what I think we have to think about is what women's oppression gives to the class societies that makes them more stable than potentially matriarchal versions who don't have women's oppression. So the kind of the one line sort of slightly hand wavy explanation, which I myself was guilty of in my essay in the Marxism and Women's Liberation book, is that, well, if you're a man, then the only way that you know who your children are, so that you can pass on your material wealth that you've gained in this new class society, is if you control the women who have your children for you. So that's where men have then an interest in controlling women, in making women into property. So this is what Engels says is the historic defeat of the female sex. And I think obviously that's true, but it doesn't anymore feel to me like that's the complete explanation. I mean, quite apart from that, it's kind of based on men caring that their sons and not someone else's sons gets their property after they die. And that doesn't seem to me quite a sufficient explanation. I think there's a deeper explanation that it's about controlling women, because if you think about it, if you control the other people in your household, then what you've got there is that you're controlling the reproduction of labor. You're controlling how actually everyone's going to be fed, how everyone's going to be brought up, and so on. And that is kind of that's power at the household level. And you also get to make sure that any sort of leftover, the profit, well, it's not profit, but any sort of surplus from the reproduction of labor goes to you as the sort of the head of the household. So that it's not just a kind of a rather theoretical thing about your sons will inherit your nice axe. It's actually sort of concretely at that point that you're in charge of your household's bit of that reproduction of labor. And that, I think, and the reason why that matters, I think, for this argument is that what that gives then to men who are otherwise being exploited is it gives them a bit of benefit from the system that means that they're more likely to buy into it. They're more likely to think, well, actually, it is worth putting up with being exploited and having to give half my harvest to the chief's tax collectors because I get to control my own household. So I think it's possible, therefore, that's why the patriarchal versions of these early class societies win out over the matriarchal ones, because you're giving enough people further down the hierarchy in the class system enough reason to put up with it, rather than to overthrow it or go off and live in the woods or whatever else they might do. And I think that's why that shows you, I think, the role that women's oppression is playing in developing and maintaining these class societies, and it's why it's why they win over the matriarchal versions, I think. So I think that's how that's the role that women's oppression plays in how this becomes sort of the dominant model. So this is a nice trip through ancient history, and it has the advantage that I can't possibly prove any of this, but hey, you just have to go with my model anyway. But so what does this tell us for today? So I think there's three things that if I've got time, I want to bring out. So the first thing is this question about how oppression relates to biology. So you can see from what I've talked about that women's oppression, it's not random. It's not dividing society on the basis of earlobes. It does arise from the female biological characteristics, that it's about controlling the reproduction of labor, which after all is way beyond, but is partly physically reproducing the next generation of humans. So women's reproductive function is obviously important for that, and does matter. And it's true that even today, individual women's experience of oppression is often sharpest around issues of reproduction and care of children and so on. This isn't completely divorceable from biology, but it's not the case that it arises inevitably from that function. So we can't just say that, oh, well, it's because of women's biology in a kind of a reductive sense. It's a historical feature of the development of class. It's not that anything about women's biology makes them controllable. But the important point here also is that it works on women as a group. It's not according to individual choices. You can't say that you, individual specific women, are oppressed because of your individual specific biology. So as we know, women who don't have children are still going to be oppressed in the sense that employers who think, well, I'm not going to employ a woman who might then have to take maternity leave off, regardless of whether actually that particular woman is ever intending to take maternity leave. So, and kind of, the assumption that women will be the one who will take on caring responsibilities when it arises. I mean, that works regardless of individual women's choices. That's just sort of a society-wide assumption that will become relevant to them at any point in their lives when those sorts of things come up. It's not about women as an individual in that sense. So we have to, while understanding that women's oppression is not kind of random or free floating, it's not about our individual biology. It's about the fact that we are members of the female sex. So I think that's important to be clear about. I think it's also important to understand how women's oppression, because it's not separate from exploitation, it's not a kind of a thing that just sits there and doesn't change since the Neolithic. It adapts and it changes as exploitative systems change. So, for example, I mean, Lindsay German could probably talk much better about this than me, but there is, of course, we can see throughout history the way that the composition and the function of the family changes as the requirements of the mode of production change. So there are fundamental shifts in the way that the family works from, to the feudal system and any system pre-capitalism, where the household is the main site of production. So there isn't this kind of whether you stay at home or whether you go to work, because that's not really a important distinction. Whereas when you get to capitalism and you want workers to start going out to factories, there becomes this whole that the role of the family in production becomes very different. And of course, even within capitalism, the role of the family keeps on shifting, because not just in a kind of a the ruling class wakes up one day and thinks, what, we want the role of the family to be X. This is always a site of struggle. So for example, in the sort of the earlier industrial revolution, when you start having women and children working in factories, that has a terrible effect on their ability to survive. So you have struggles to enable the men to be paid enough so that the women can stay at home and can do sort of more sort of artisanal things and take care of the children so that they don't all die. So that's a kind of that model then of the women don't go to work, the women stay at home, becomes then something that locks women into low paid employment, and also then becomes very oppressive on a kind of a possibly at a sort of personal level. But it was something that was struggled for. So this is again, the sort of the meaning of the family structure shifts as the needs of exploitation shift. And I think that this is important, and it's important to understand about how oppression works, that just because it's something that is created, broadly created by elites to maintain exploitation, it doesn't mean that it's particularly conscious on their part. I mean, at some points it can be, but in some points it's just sort of assumed that this is part of how you behave as an elite. And it's not that they can turn it on and off like a switch. Yeah, and actually, I think this is sometimes the places where actually we have there's the most ability to combat particular features of oppression is where there's kind of a tension between what elites have spent the last 100 or so years convincing society that this is the right way to behave and this is what we disapprove of, and then actually the needs of exploitation have shifted, and you kind of want to shift that. So you see, so where you have sort of fights between sort of social conservatives and sort of more sort of progressive conservatives, if you like, can sometimes be the places where we can sort of insert ourselves and we can make real gains because there's already tension. So on the obvious examples is on sort of gay marriage and sort of homosexuality and issues around that, where you can clearly see there's kind of actually the kind of double income, no kids, sort of couples is like, yeah, okay, they've got lots of money, that's great. There's whole factions of capitalism that think that, yes, okay, we don't want to be doing homophobia anymore, we want to get people to be out buying things and not having to spend money on children and so on, and this is all really good. But you have a whole kind of rump of social conservatives who are still in the old homophobia is useful because it buttresses the nuclear family. And I think there's arguably, I think this is similar with the things about whether women should be able to walk the streets at night without being attacked or without fearing being attacked. I think this is another point where that kind of respectable women don't go out at night used to be part of that sort of maintenance of the nuclear family, and husband should expect to have his dinner on the table and know where his wife is and not let her go out afterwards, and that was also that kind of, well, if you're a woman and you're out in the streets after dark, then you're asking for whatever was coming for you, was kind of part of that, and you could see what function it had. Whereas now, actually, you can see that that's not actually so useful. It's presumably much, it's much handier if you can make women do the night shift without having to deal with, well, they have to be able to be put in a cab to go home because it's not safe for them to go home on the night bus. You can see that actually it would fit the needs of capitalism in a sense for that sort of fear that we all have of walking the streets after dark wasn't there. So it's kind of a point of strain, I think, and I think that's why actually this is kind of an opportunity for us. And I think the demonstrations around Sarah Everard's death are really powerful in that, because it's a point of friction, because you can, if you're a ruling class, you can start these sort of oppressive ideas, but you can't necessarily stop them, and that's always a problem for kind of ruling by division and oppression. So the third point that I wanted to make, because I'm aware of running out of time, is that it's true that every woman suffers women's oppression. That is a reality of women's lives. But what we have to understand is that it's not a separate thing from exploitation. So how it works is dependent on class, and that's always true, and therefore it's still true that campaigning against women's oppression has to be on the basis of class solidarity. We have more in common with working class men than we do with bourgeois women. I mean, this is kind of, you've heard this said many times before, but it is still true. And I think, recent events has shown us that we have very, very little in common with Priti Patel and Cressida Dick. Their interests are not our interests. But we as working class women have the same interests with all the working class men who have also been on the vigils for Sarah Everard, who are protesting, fantastically protesting in Bristol against the police bill, and so on and so on. So I think we have to understand that we do have to make common cause with men who also actually would benefit from a society without women's oppression. It's not really about asking men to give up something. It's actually saying, well, if we had a society without exploitation, without women's oppression, actually we would be much better off. And it's in our class interest to fight together for that. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elaine. I can see lots of people